While it is not often mentioned in the Western media, the Naxalite rebellion in India represents a significant threat to the establishment in its effectiveness and its level of popular support. According to some reports, the Naxals control up to one-third of India's territory at any given time, and in some places they have established alternate governments. The Naxals, an alliance of communist parties across India representing the country's poorest and most exploited people, have taken up arms against India's government in what they say is a struggle against widespread poverty and oppression, perpetuated by the policies of the ruling class and the theft of land and resources by Indian and multinational corporations. Both in India and in the West, the establishment views the Naxals as violent extremists who must be eliminated. The fact that the Naxals are retaliating against severe poverty, oppression, and exploitation is agreed upon by all sides. However, the legitimacy of the Naxalite struggle remains a topic of debate. While the conflict is undoubtedly bloody, the Indian government continues its attempts to violently suppress the insurgency even as its popularity grows. The response of the Indian ruling class so far has been to ignore the obvious economic solutions such as land reform and instead focus on a counterinsurgency campaign using police and paramilitary units to suppress the rebellion, despite criticisms of numerous human rights activists. According to a study published in 2010 by researchers at Oxford University, India contains more impoverished people than all of sub-Saharan Africa, with over 421 million living in deep poverty in 8 of India's 28 states, the highest concentration of severe poverty in the world. The Oxford study found that the severity of poverty in some parts of India exceeds that of Africa. India, the world's second most populous country, has seen much economic growth in recent decades due to industrial development projects, although overall poverty has increased. The country has accepted billions of dollars in IMF loans over the past decades and has established policies highly favorable to multinational corporations. Most of the upper and middle class in India support the economic reforms the country has adopted, which have spurred growth. However, this economic growth has been highly uneven, and its benefits have not been shared by India's lower classes, who find themselves marginalized in the face of increasing industrial development and demand for resources. The Naxals take their name from a village in eastern India called Naxalbari, where the movement began as an armed rebellion against India's government in 1967. The movement spread across India's central and eastern regions over the next 3 decades as it gained support from intellectuals. The areas affected by the Naxalite rebellion include India's poorest and most highly populous states. The ideology has taken hold among various classes of economically and politically dispossessed people in India, aligning them against the middle and upper classes in a bid to take state power. Among the oppressed peoples the Naxals claim to represent are the Dalits, or untouchables, and the Adivasis, or tribal peoples, who often find themselves forced off their lands by the government in the interests of industrial development. Using India's dense jungles for cover, the insurgents employ guerrilla warfare tactics, routinely targeting police, as well as mining operations, industrial plants, government buildings, and cell phone towers. As the Naxalite movement has gained support, their attacks on Indian state forces have grown in intensity, with reports of increasingly more advanced weaponry being used. Despite acknowledgments of the social, economic, and political factors in the insurgency, the Indian government continues to engage in paramilitary and policing operations against the rebels, often committing brutal or illegal acts in the process, actions which are likely to increase popular support for the Naxals. Torture is commonly used in interrogations of suspected Naxals, who often do not survive police detainment. Besides illegally confiscating Naxalite and other literature not banned under Indian law, the police also routinely make lists of anyone attending pro-Naxal meetings or demonstrations, often arresting ideological supporters of Naxalism, including writers and activists, without legal basis. Some Naxalite recruitment is a consequence of Indian military operations which injure or kill innocent villagers. More state repression will only prolong the violence, as the insurgency relies heavily on a sense of perceived injustice among the poor. An abundance of scientific evidence exists that social and economic inequality are primary factors in violence. 2 public health researchers, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, have authored a book, The Spirit Level, published in 2009, which contains information compiled from approximately 200 sets of data showing a strong correlation between economic inequality and degradation in societal health. Wilkinson and Pickett observed that societies which favor growth over equality tend to suffer from higher levels of unhappiness, shorter lifespans, and increased rates of violence, teenage pregnancy, addiction, and imprisonment. The researchers point out that the ill effects of social inequality are widespread across societies, affecting both rich and poor, and that these effects can be seen across the world in various countries. Wilkinson and Pickett draw the conclusion from their research that societal health and individual health are integrally linked, and that social equality is a requirement for each. Another study, conducted by African and British researchers and published in 2006, compared inequalities in various countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. The study found that ethnic and religious violence in these regions was primarily due to horizontal inequalities in the area of land, income, capital, education, health services, political power, and cultural recognition. An interesting aspect of this study is its observation that economic and political inequality are less likely to lead to large-scale violent conflicts if they do not exist simultaneously. Conditions in India are undoubtedly ripe for social unrest as the poor find themselves both economically and politically disenfranchised. Those condemning the Naxals for their use of violence often overlook not only the violence carried out by Indian paramilitary forces in dealing with the rebellion, but also the structural economic violence suffered by India's poor as a result of collusion between the government and multinational corporations. India's poor are undeniably the victims of a class war, and it is to be expected that they should fight back. The Naxals address key political and economic issues which affect the poor, specifically issues of self-determination. The horrible conditions suffered by India's poor are the breeding ground of armed revolution, as it becomes the only perceived method of exercising self-determination. Given the nature of social forces, it is unlikely that India's ruling elites will ever willingly make the necessary changes to bring about social equality, a notion which the Naxals take to heart in waging an armed struggle. Whether or not one supports the Naxals' cause, an ever-increasing amount of scientific research suggests that the social tensions created by severe inequality lead to violence. As long as significant social, political, and economic inequalities exist within any society, a state of violence will exist irrespective of anyone's moral or political sensibilities. If we are to create a healthy world for future generations, we as individuals must strive for a more equal and just global society.